She handed me the invitation like it was a chore she was assigning me, not a date, not a night out together, a task. "The company's hosting a dinner at the Langham Hotel downtown Friday night," Camille said, not looking up from her laptop. "I need you there." I set down my coffee. "You need me there?" "Technically, it's for partners and spouses. It would look strange if I came alone." She finally glanced at me over the screen. "Just don't embarrass me, Miles. These are important people." That was it. "No, I'd love for you to come. No, it'll be a nice evening out. Just don't embarrass me." I said yes. Of course I said yes. That's what I'd been doing for the better part of 6 years. Saying yes, staying quiet, making myself small enough to fit into whatever shape Camille needed me to be in that particular moment. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that Friday night was going to change everything. Not because of anything I did, but because of who walked through those doors. And when she didn't look at the room full of directors and vice presidents and senior managers who'd been competing for her attention for weeks. She walked straight past all of them. Past Camille, past the table of executives who were already standing to greet her. She walked straight to me, and she said 4 words that made Camille's champagne glass slip from her fingers and shatter on the marble floor of the Langham Hotel. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit subscribe, and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from? Because what happened to Miles starts right here. My name is Miles Devereaux. I'm 47 years old. I live in Chicago, Illinois, the kind of city that swallows you whole if you let it. All wind and concrete and ambition, people moving so fast they forget to look at the person standing right next to them. For 12 years, I worked as a structural engineer. I designed load-bearing systems for high-rise buildings, the invisible architecture that keeps skyscrapers from folding in on themselves. I was good at it, genuinely good. I understood how forces worked, how pressure distributed, how something could look solid from the outside while carrying enormous stress inside. I left that career 12 years ago under circumstances I never fully explained to anyone. Not to my brother, not to my father, and certainly not to Camille. People who know me now, the neighbors on our street in Lincoln Park, the parents at the school fundraisers Camille drags me to, the couple we have dinner with twice a year because Camille considers them useful. They see a man who does freelance consulting work from home. Contract projects. Nothing glamorous. Nothing that requires a business card or a title. They don't ask about it. Camille doesn't encourage questions about it. And I stopped volunteering information a long time ago. What they don't know is that I left structural engineering because I discovered something. Something about a project I'd been lead engineer on. Something about decisions that had been made above me that I hadn't authorized and didn't know about. And when I brought it forward, when I sat in front of the partners at the firm and laid out what I'd found, I was offered a very quiet, very generous settlement, a signed non-disclosure agreement, and a career that effectively ceased to exist overnight. I took the money, I signed the papers, I buried it, and then I spent the next 12 years trying to figure out who I was without the only thing that had ever made me feel certain about myself. I met Camille 18 months after I left the firm. She was sharp, put together, the kind of woman who walks into a room and immediately understands its social architecture. Who matters, who's performing, who's actually running things. I found that fascinating. Attractive, even. What I didn't understand yet was that for Camille, everyone in every room existed somewhere on a hierarchy, and her entire energy was directed toward climbing it. Including me. In the beginning, I fit into her vision. I was educated, presentable. I had money from the settlement, enough that I wasn't a liability. I didn't ask for much. I didn't make waves. I was, in Camille's particular taxonomy of people, useful. We got married 4 years in. The wedding was at the Drake Hotel on Michigan Avenue. 300 guests, a dinner that cost more than most. People's annual salary. Camille had managed every detail herself. I showed up in the suit she'd chosen and said the words when I was supposed to say them. I don't know exactly when things began to shift. These things are never one moment. There are 100 small moments that you rationalize individually until one day you're standing in your own kitchen and your wife is speaking to you the way she speaks to the parking attendant who takes too long, and you realize you can't remember the last time she asked you a question that wasn't logistical. By the time of the company dinner, I had been invisible for years. Not to everyone. Not to my brother Derek, who called every Sunday and genuinely wanted to know how I was doing. Not to Mrs. Okafor, the 71-year-old woman next door who brought me tomatoes from her garden in the summer and whose furnace I'd helped fix 2 winters ago. But to Camille, to the life she'd constructed, I was a prop. A correctly dressed, quietly obedient prop that she deployed when social expectations required a spouse. The Langham Hotel sits on North Wacker Drive, and if you've never been inside, let me tell you, it is the kind of place that is designed specifically to make you aware of your own worth. The ceilings are high. The light is golden and warm in a way that feels engineered rather than accidental. Every surface suggests money without mentioning it. Camille had been promoted 8 months earlier to Regional Vice President of Business Development at her consulting firm, Ashford Meridian Group. It was a significant move, the kind that comes with a parking spot, a salary bump, and an entirely new tier of people you needed to impress. The dinner Friday night was to welcome the firm's incoming CEO, a new appointment from outside the company. Someone the senior leadership had been excited and nervous about in equal measure for weeks, though the details had been kept deliberately vague. All anyone knew was that she had a reputation for transformation. Firms she entered didn't look the same when she left, and that she had specifically requested an informal dinner rather than a formal presentation before her first official day. In the car on the way there, Camille ran me through the rules. "Don't lead any conversations," she said, checking her lipstick in the visor mirror. "If someone asks what you do, say you're an independent consultant. Don't be specific." "All right. Stay near me, but not next to me. If there's a group, position yourself slightly behind. These people don't need to be managing you." I kept my eyes on Lakeshore Drive, the skyline ahead of us lit against the October dark. "Ann Miles." She clicked the mirror shut. "If I'm in a conversation, don't interrupt. Don't try to be charming. Just be present and quiet." I turned to look at her for a moment. "You're asking me to attend a dinner and not speak. I'm asking you not to make me look bad." There it was, the sentence she reached for so reliably that I'd stopped flinching when it came. Don't make me look bad. As though my presence in any room was primarily a risk to be managed. As though the most useful thing I could offer was my silence. "Okay," I said. She turned toward the window. "Thank you." The dinner was set in the Langham's private event space, a room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago River, the lights of the city reflected in the dark water below. Round tables, white linens, low arrangements of white flowers. Maybe 60 people in total. Senior partners, regional directors, a few of the firm's major clients. Camille moved through the room like she was born for it. I watched her work, the confident handshake, the precisely calibrated laugh, the way she angled her body to include or exclude people from conversations based on calculations I could see her making in real time. She was genuinely skilled at this. That was never the question. I orbited at the required distance, slightly behind, quiet, a correctly dressed piece of furniture. A man named Trevor, one of the senior partners, I gathered, made his way over to me at one point while Camille was occupied across the room. He was maybe 55, red-faced from drink, and in the way of men who are used to being interesting, he was very boring. "So you're Camille's husband," he said. "What is it you do?" "Independent consulting," I said. "Infrastructure and systems." He nodded, the way people nod when they're not listening. "Camille's fantastic, you know, real asset to the firm. You must be proud." "I am," I said. He drifted away. I picked up a glass of water from a passing tray and found a position near the windows where I could see the river and not be in anyone's way. I had been standing there for perhaps 10 minutes when the energy in the room changed. It's a particular shift. You know it when you feel it. The way sound pulls back slightly. The way heads turn in a single direction. The way a collective posture adjustment moves through a room like a slow wave. Someone important had arrived. I didn't turn around immediately. I watched it happen in the reflections of the window glass in front of me, the crowd near the entrance parting slightly, Camille's attention snapping away from the conversation she'd been having, the senior partners moving purposefully toward the door. Then I did turn around, and the world went completely still. Her name was Nora Callahan. I knew her face the way you know a scar, not because you look at it constantly, but because it's been a part of you long enough that you stop noticing when you stop noticing. Nora Callahan. 44 years old. Dark hair, shorter now than I remembered. The same precise way of holding herself, upright but not rigid, like a structure that knows exactly where its weight sits. I hadn't seen her in 15 years. She was scanning the room, the kind of professional scan you do when you walk into a space and immediately need to understand it, exits, groupings, energy, dynamics. A habit she'd had since the first day I met her, when she walked into the project site on the Alderman Street building in the East Loop and introduced herself as the junior safety compliance officer who'd been assigned to our firm. We'd worked together for 3 years. 3 years of early mornings and late nights, of problems that didn't have obvious solutions until they did, of the particular intimacy that comes from building something together and knowing you're both the reason it's standing. And then I had found what I'd found, and I'd sat in front of the partners and told the truth. And Nora, who had come to me 2 weeks before that meeting with the same documentation I'd gathered, who had said, "Miles, we have to report this, we can't just let this go." Nora had been the one who helped me build the case. We'd both been pushed out. She'd lost more than I had. She'd had less of a safety net. She'd had a 5-year-old daughter and a lease she couldn't break, and a reputation in the industry that they'd quietly, methodically damaged in ways that were designed to be untraceable. I had signed my NDA and taken my settlement and effectively vanished. Nora had fought. I knew that much from the few things I'd been able to learn over the years, carefully, at the edges of my agreement, just enough to know she was still out there. I knew she'd rebuilt. I knew she'd built something of her own. I didn't know it had become this. She was still scanning the room, and then her eyes found mine. It didn't happen the way things like this happen in movies. There was no dramatic freeze, no music shift, no slow motion. What happened was simpler and more devastating than that. She stopped. For just a fraction of a second, in a room full of 60 people who were all competing for her attention, Nora Callahan stopped. And I watched something move across her face. Recognition, yes, but also something underneath it. Something that looked like relief. And then she moved. Not toward Camille, who was already positioning herself at the front of the group near the entrance, ready to be the first to make an impression. Not toward Trevor, who was saying something to the person beside him about Nora's track record at her previous firm. Not toward the cluster of senior partners who had formed a semicircle of professional welcome. She walked across the room, directly, without hesitation, through the semicircle, past Camille, who looked up in slight confusion, past all of it. She stopped in front of me, and I saw her eyes were bright, too bright, and I understood that she was holding something back by sheer force of will, the same force of will I'd watched carry her through things that should have broken her. "Miles," she said, and then quietly, in a voice that was not quite steady, "I never stopped searching for you." Somewhere behind her, I heard it, the particular musical pitch of crystal on marble, Camille's champagne glass, on the floor. Nora and I stood in the middle of that room for perhaps 30 seconds that felt like a complete rearrangement of the last 15 years. I said her name. I said it carefully, the way you handle something fragile that you didn't know you still had. "What are you doing here?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. I just needed a moment before the answer became fully real. "Apparently I run this company now," she said. And despite everything, despite Camille frozen 6 feet behind her and 60 people staring and the complete implosion of whatever social choreography the evening had been built around, she laughed. A small, real laugh. "Come find me in 10 minutes, she said quietly. "There's a balcony off the east corridor. I need to know everything." And then she straightened, turned to the room, and became the CEO again. Composed, formidable, the version of herself that 60 people in this room would spend the rest of their careers trying to impress. I stood where I was and breathed. Camille reached me in approximately 45 seconds. "How do you know her?" Her voice was very controlled in the way that meant the opposite. "We worked together," I said, "a long time ago." "You worked together." She looked at me the way she looked at expenses she hadn't approved. "You were a consultant. She's the CEO of a national firm." I wasn't always a consultant. This was the conversation I had never had. The 12 years of questions Camille had never actually asked and I had never offered to answer, arriving all at once in a hotel ballroom on the Chicago River. She stared at me, and I watched her do the math. Not the emotional math, but the social math. The calculation of what this meant for her position, for the impression she'd been so carefully constructing all evening. "Miles, go work the room," I said, not unkindly, not with anger, just with the quiet certainty of a man who has finally found the solid ground under him. "I need to go have a conversation." I left her standing there and walked toward the east corridor. The balcony at the Langham looks north up the river. It was cold out. October in Chicago doesn't negotiate, but neither of us mentioned it. We stood against the railing and the city went about its business below us. indifferent and enormous and beautiful. I hired a private investigator 3 years ago, Nora said, trying to find you. He came back with nothing. I figured you'd moved, maybe changed your name. I thought maybe you just didn't want to be found. I was here, I said. I've been here the whole time. She turned to look at me. Why didn't you ever reach out? The NDA. Miles. Her voice was patient, but not gentle. I beat the NDA. Mine and yours. 4 years of litigation. The settlement they paid to make it quiet. You should have received documentation about your portion 2 years ago. I was very still. I didn't receive anything. Something moved across her face. Who handled your legal affairs? I thought about the firm. About the attorney they'd assigned me. About the paperwork I'd signed and filed and stopped thinking about. A man named Patterson, from the firm's legal team. Nora closed her eyes briefly. Patterson was Hargrove's attorney, not yours. They gave you their lawyer and told you he was working for you. I heard this. I took a moment to let it settle into the full weight of what it meant. So, the settlement? There was a larger settlement, Nora said. Significantly larger, and you were entitled to your portion. I don't know where it went, but I know you didn't get it. She paused. I know because I tried to find you to tell you. We stood there in the October wind, and I looked at the river. 15 years. 15 years of making myself smaller, of signing and burying and rebuilding from nothing in a different direction, of a life that had contracted down to orbiting someone who'd stopped seeing me. And the whole time, there was a thread I hadn't known about, that Nora had been holding on the other end. Tell me what you've been doing, she said. So I told her. All of it. The settlement that wasn't what it appeared. The consulting work. The marriage. The 12 years of being slowly reduced to something that showed up at company dinners and stood slightly behind. She listened the way she always had, completely, without interrupting, filing things away. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. I built something, she said finally, after they pushed us out. It took years. I lost things I'm not going to list right now because we'd be here until morning, but I built it. She looked at me directly. And the first major acquisition I made with real capital, the company I bought that gave me the leverage to become what I am right now, was built on the engineering documentation you filed. The report you submitted before they silenced you. A judge used it to establish negligence. It opened everything. I didn't know that. I know you didn't. I tried to tell you. She turned back to the river. Miles, what you did, sitting in front of those men and telling the truth, it cost you everything, and you did it anyway. I never forgot that. I've never stopped being angry on your behalf that they made you pay so much for doing the right thing. I didn't know what to do with this. I'd spent 12 years understanding what I'd lost. I hadn't spent much time thinking about what I'd done that had been worth something. What happens now? I asked. Now, Nora said. You tell me everything you know about infrastructure consulting, because I have 17 active projects across the Midwest and I need someone I can trust absolutely. She paused. And you figure out what you actually want your life to look like. Because from everything you've described, it doesn't sound like anyone's asked you that question in a very long time. She was right. No one had, including me. We went back inside after 20 minutes. The dinner had continued without us. The partners had regrouped, the conversation had resumed, the social choreography had rearranged itself around our absence. Camille found me the moment I came back through the corridor door. She looked like a woman who had been running calculations for 20 minutes straight. We should talk, she said. Yes, I agreed. We should. She pulled me to a quieter corner near the bar. Who is she really? What is this? Her name is Nora Callahan, I said. She was my colleague. 15 years ago, we both uncovered serious safety violations at the firm I worked for. We both reported them. We were both forced out. She fought. I settled. She built something from what came after. Now she runs a national consulting company, and she is apparently the incoming CEO of your firm. Camille stared at me. You were a structural engineer. Yes. You told me you were always a consultant. You never asked. I told you I did consulting work. You assumed I'd always done consulting work. I let you assume it. This was true, and I understood, saying it, that it was also my failure, that I'd made myself so small, had grown so accustomed to being whatever shape was required, that I'd stopped offering the parts of myself that didn't fit neatly into Camille's picture. Why didn't you tell me? She asked. Because every time I tried to talk about the past, you redirected the conversation to something current, to the dinner party, to the budget, to whatever you needed from me in that moment. I kept my voice even. You weren't interested in who I was before you met me, Camille. You were interested in who I was in relation to your life. She opened her mouth, closed it. That's not, she started. You handed me an invitation to tonight and told me not to embarrass you, I said. You put me in a position 3 feet behind you and told me to stay quiet. That's what our marriage looks like right now. I don't know if it's always looked like that and I just stopped noticing or if it changed. But that's what it looks like. The music in the room shifted. Something slow and orchestrated. Background noise for people doing important socializing. Around us, 60 people continued their evening, unaware of the quiet implosion happening in the corner by the bar. Miles, Camille said, and her voice was different now. The professional precision was gone. Something underneath it was visible. I didn't mean... I know, I said, and I did. That was the complicated part. She hadn't meant it as cruelty. She'd meant it as management. She managed everything, including me, and she'd gotten so efficient at it that she'd stopped noticing what it was costing. I think we need to have a real conversation, I said. Not tonight, but soon. She nodded slowly. Something behind her eyes. I'd call it fear, though I'd have to think about what exactly she was afraid of. Maybe losing the prop. Maybe the larger thing underneath that. Maybe herself. Okay, she said quietly. I nodded. And then I went to find Nora because there were things I needed to understand and 15 years of catching up that couldn't wait for a convenient moment. The evening ended the way evenings like that end. All warmth and handshakes, cars pulling up on Wacker Drive, the November cold biting at people who weren't dressed for the walk to the garage. Nora and I had exchanged numbers in the way of people who are genuinely going to use them. She'd also given me the name of a lawyer she trusted and suggested I have the original settlement documentation reviewed. She'd said it practically, professionally, like a problem she was identifying and routing to the correct solution. But before she left, she said one more thing. She took me slightly aside, not dramatically, just enough for privacy, and she said, I want you to know that I meant what I said. I looked for you, not because of the case or the litigation or any of what I'm doing professionally. I looked for you because you were one of the only people in my life who did the right thing when it was the hardest possible choice, and I wanted you to know it mattered. I didn't say anything immediately. I wasn't sure what to say. It helped more than I realized, I finally offered. Knowing you were still out there. She looked at me for a moment. Then let's not lose each other again. No, I agreed. Let's not. In the weeks that followed, a great deal changed. My brother Derek had been asking me for 2 years whether I was happy. I'd deflected every time with the same comfortable vagueness I deflected everything. 2 weeks after the Langham dinner, I called him and answered the question honestly for the first time. No, I said. I haven't been for a long time. I know, Derek said. He didn't say it unkindly. He said it the way someone says it when they've been waiting, and the waiting is finally over. The lawyer Nora recommended, a woman named Patricia Greer, based downtown on South LaSalle, reviewed my original settlement documents and found exactly what Nora had suspected. The attorney I'd been assigned had been working for the firm's interests, not mine. There was money I hadn't received. There were rights I hadn't known I had. Patricia laid it out for me across 2.5 hours in a conference room overlooking Grant Park, and when she was done, I sat for a moment looking at the documentation and thought about all the years I'd spent assuming the story was already finished. Camille and I had 3 difficult conversations over the course of November. They were the most honest conversations we'd had in years, maybe ever. What came out of them was this. We had both been performing versions of ourselves that didn't entirely exist, for each other and for the world. Camille had her own history she'd compressed into a shape that fit her ambitions. I had mine. We had never actually introduced those histories to each other. We had been 2 people in proximity, sharing a house and a social calendar, married to the idea of each other more than to the actual people. We decided to separate. There was no dramatic scene. There was no thrown champagne, though I thought about the sound of that glass hitting the marble floor at the Langham and understood it as a kind of punctuation, the sound of a narrative finding its end. She kept the house in Lincoln Park. I moved to Wicker Park, a 3rd-floor apartment on North Milwaukee Avenue with windows that got the morning light and neighbors I could actually hear and a quiet that felt earned rather than oppressive. My neighbor on the left was a retired schoolteacher named Howard, who kept irregular hours and sometimes knocked on my door to offer food he'd made too much of. On my right was a young woman named Priya, who was doing her medical residency and occasionally asked me to listen for packages. I cooked my own meals. I slept when I was tired. I worked in the mornings on a project Nora had brought me in on, a consulting role on the structural assessment of 3 aging commercial properties the firm was considering acquiring in the South Loop. It was real work, the kind that asked something from me and gave something back. On Sunday mornings, Derek called. I answered. There's something about finding out your story isn't finished the way you thought it was. I had spent 12 years living as though the most important chapters were behind me. As though the correct response to what had happened was to close it off, to take up less space, to make myself into something that could survive in whatever room it found itself in without asking too much of the room. The night at the Langham had pulled a thread I didn't know was still attached to anything. Nora and I met for coffee on a Tuesday morning in early December, at a place on West Randolph Street she liked, the kind of spot that had been there long enough to be unimpressed by itself. We talked for 3 hours. We talked about what we'd both built and what we'd both lost and what 15 years of a different kind of living had done to each of us. She'd never married. She'd raised her daughter, who was now 20 years old and studying architecture at the University of Illinois at Chicago, which Nora mentioned with a satisfaction so complete and grounded that I understood it as the kind of pride that doesn't need an audience. She'd built her company from 4 people in a shared workspace in Milwaukee to something with offices in 5 cities. She'd done it by understanding something she'd had to learn the hard way, that you cannot build anything lasting on a foundation that isn't honest, not a building, not a company, not a life. The thing I think about, she said, wrapping her hands around her coffee mug, is how much energy goes into maintaining a false picture. The firm we worked for spent more energy managing what people knew than they spent on actual engineering. And eventually it collapsed because that's what happens when the load-bearing elements are fake. A structural metaphor, I said. We're structural engineers, she said. It's what we've got. She was right. It's what we had, the language of forces and load, and what holds things up when pressure is applied. I had spent 12 years pretending I wasn't an engineer, and wondering why nothing felt solid. By January, I had been brought on as a full consultant to Ashford Meridian Group. My title, which still felt slightly strange to say out loud, was Director of Structural Assessment, a new role Nora had created because she said she was tired of working with people who didn't understand the difference between what a building looked like and what it could actually hold. Camille had been professional about the professional intersection. She was a regional vice president. I was a consultant. We were courteous and efficient in our limited interactions, the way adults are when they've agreed that the past is the past and the future needs to be navigated carefully. Patricia Greer's review of my original settlement had led to a mediated renegotiation. I won't say the number because it doesn't matter. What matters is that what I'd thought was a closed door turned out to have been a door that had simply been shut in my face while I was still inside. Howard next door made too much chili on a Thursday night in February and knocked on my door. We ended up talking for 2 hours about his 30 years in the Chicago public school system, about the kids he still thought about what it meant to do work that mattered, and whether you could ever really know while you were doing it. I told him I was starting to figure it out. Mrs. Okafor from Lincoln Park sent me a text when she heard I'd moved. My brother had told her because Derek tells people things, which is one of the better things about him. She said, "Miles, tomatoes this summer wherever you land. Don't forget the people who see you." I hadn't forgotten. Here is what I know now that I didn't know a year ago. I know that disappearing is a choice that feels like survival but functions like a slow collapse. I know that the people who try to make you invisible are usually terrified of their own visibility. I know that 15 years is a long time to carry something alone, but it is not too long to put it down. I know that the truth I told in a conference room in a building that no longer exists, the structural report that laid out exactly what was wrong and why it mattered, that truth had traveled further than I'd known, had done more than I'd been allowed to see, had found its way, through Nora's hands and a judge's gavel and years of litigation I hadn't been part of, into something that held. I know that Nora Callahan walked into the Langham Hotel on a Friday night in October and walked directly to me, and that when she said, "I never stopped searching for you," she meant it in more ways than one. I know that a champagne glass on a marble floor makes a sound that you don't forget. And I know that some endings are the loudest part of a beginning you hadn't seen coming. My name is Miles Devereaux. I'm 47 years old. I'm a structural engineer. I'm still figuring out what I can hold. You know what gets me about Miles's story? He wasn't weak. He was trained to be quiet by someone who benefited from his silence. And that's the part nobody talks about. How the people closest to us can slowly shrink us down, and we let them, because we call it love. But here's what I want you to take from tonight. The truth you told years ago. The right thing you did when it cost you everything. That doesn't disappear. It travels. It finds its way back to you. Miles signed his name on documents and walked away thinking his story was over. It wasn't. Yours isn't either.